Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ekta. I'll be your hall coordinator for Hall and Hole's session Tips and Tricks for Collection of Ocular Samples. May I invite Dr. Manisha Agarwal to introduce us to the topic, and then we'll have all the speakers have their talk session one by one. And at the end, we'll have a short panel discussion with the leftover time. Thank you.
Thank you,
Over to
Ekta.
you, Manisha, ma'am.
Thank you, Ekta, and thank you, AIOS, for giving us the opportunity of having this IC here today. And without wasting any time, I would just introduce the session. It's primarily to give various useful tips to our delegates on collecting various ocular samples, which sometimes can be extremely important for reaching a conclusive diagnosis. So my first speaker is Dr. Somchila Murthy. She is the head of Cornea, Refractive and Uveitis Services at LV Prasad Eye Institute, Hyderabad. And she would be giving us some interesting tips of collecting corneal and conjunctival samples. Over to you, Somshila.
Hello, Dr. Manisha, and thank you so much for having me in this session. I must admit that it's been a sort of a long time since I looked at talk such as the basics really. So I'm really glad that you've put together this IC. So my slides visible this time?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about conjunctival and corneal sampling. Maybe a little bit more about keratitis because that's what I look at very, very often. And also biopsy pathology in various conjunctival lesions and a few videos on how to follow certain techniques. So just to acknowledge that all the microbiology slides and videos that I'm going to show are shared to me by our microbiology colleagues at my institute, Dr. Savitri Sharma and Dr. Jovita Joseph. And all the histopathology slides are and the videos from Dr. Dilip Mishra and Professor Geeta K. Vemuganti, who are ophthalmic pathologists. So what are the indications for conjunctival samples? So very often we come across conjunctival lesions, but just pushing across the indications would also mean that if we want to, it used to be one of the ways to diagnose a case of limbal stem cell deficiency, either when we take a biopsy, for example, this clinical picture here shows a large area of conjunctival overgrowth or pannus. And when you excise this, this is what you see, that on the cornea, there is a huge conjunctival overgrowth, which is hypertrophic, and a few goblet cells at the base. And this is what you get in the biopsy. But you can also take imprints or impression cytology from this area. And in the earlier days of when we were recognizing limbal stem cell deficiency, we used to have a criteria of having impression cytology features, which would show squamous kind of cells on the imprint and also some goblet cells on the corneal surface. So that's how we would diagnose a case of limbal stem cell deficiency. The other indications, of course, are when you see subtle conjunctival lesions, and this could be in inflammatory conditions. For example, in some cases where the only lesion you have for sarcoidosis is conjunctival granulomas, you can excise that. Or it could be a lot of potpourri of lesions. So this picture that you see is actually a very, not very, very uncommon, but what you would see sometimes is a eye worm. And this, don't have the video, but you can actually see that it moves subconjunctivally. And this kind of lesion you need to take out. You also would have multiple causes for excision biopsy, whether it's rhinosporidiosis or ophthalmia nodosa, or sometimes even caterpillar hairs, which go and lodge into the subconjunctival area causing granulomas. You have other causes of granuloma due to cotton fibers or synthetic fibers, allergic response, and those that happen after the death of the parasite. So that's Sprender-Heppley phenomenon. So coming to a few of these conditions, it's a patient with rhinosporidiosis. And this is an unusual case of a patient who had cotton that had lodged over here into the conjunctiva. And when we excise that, what you can see is all the cotton bundles of, cotton or what the fibers that were visible. This was another farmer who gave a history of some trauma. So what he had was a sort of a pseudopterygium kind of lesion. And initially, this was thought to be maybe some kind of malignancy. But when we excised it, what we could see was multiple septate filaments, which was nothing but a ball of fungus. This is yet another patient who was initially diagnosed as nodular scleritis and was also started on steroids, but the patient did not improve except for some amount of improvement. It did not go away. And excision biopsy was done, and what it showed was the skeleton of a worm. And yet another, although this is a rare case of a young patient who had this mulberry-like growth coming out from his upper conjunctival region. And this is very typical, this bleeds on touch, this papilloma. This is very typical of conjunctival amyloidosis, and that's what you could see on histopathology. So in conjunctiva, many of the times, either the diagnosis can be very simple, clinical, or when we have certain mass lesions, we need to excise them, and histopathology is the way to go for the final conclusive diagnosis. This is another patient who has a sort of a smoothened out lid margin, had chronic symptoms of chronic kind of a conjunctivitis, red eye, irritable eye, one eye more than the other for several years. And you can just about see that the fornicel foreshortening is happening. In another patient, you can see a very obvious foreshortening and symblephron and the formation of folds when you try to retract the lower lid. So this is nothing but a case of OCP. What happens to the sample is that we should take a conjunctival biopsy from the area, and immediately that particular sample is placed on OCT or optimal medium, which is a medium to be used. And this medium, the tissue is laid out flat in that medium. And this is liquid nitrous, in which we immediately freeze the tissue. The tissue is frozen in that. And from the operating room, the same casket is taken up to the pathology lab. It will freeze very fast in the optimal compound, which is required for freezing it. And then that specimen with the OCT medium is placed on the cutter, and then slowly the sections are taken. And then finally, these sections are mounted on the cover slide, and we can immediately examine this under microscope after staining for immunofluorescence. So with immunofluorescence, what you get is a representative picture, but we would see very bright staining at the edge of the basal membrane complex, and this kind of staining, and especially when you use stains for IgG, IgM, C3 and complement, these would be very specific. They would be all highlighted in cases of ocular cicatricial pemphigoid, and that's how you can diagnose it. However, only about 40% patients actually show this positive feature because there are many limitations. The sample should be taken during time of disease activity, and also you should have a very good lab to do that. So there are some limitations. So predominantly OCP diagnosis is still clinical, but you can have lab-based diagnosis to sort of have very concrete proof that this is a case of OCT. So very quickly, I'll run through some, because I'm sure I'll be running out of time, some corneal samples. Indications are multiple, and the rarer indications would be if you have an ocular surface OSSN. I'm not going to cover tumors in here. I'm going to mainly cover keratitis, but these are some examples of ocular surface OSSN, which sometimes can be missed initially. So why do we need to scrape in macroblear keratitis? What is the need? You can already make a clinical diagnosis. But the answer to that is that the need for scraping is that we need to establish the diagnosis so that we know whether it's bacterial, whether it is fungal or parasitic, and even fungal-like filaments can sometimes be pythium. So we really need to know that. And because clinical diagnosis alone is not enough, we can only make out around 65% of cases when we diagnose them clinically. So I'll quickly go through how to do the scraping. So the idea is after topical anesthesia, we need to very carefully, we can do this on the slit lamp also, scrape from the active edges of the lesion. And most of the time the patients can cooperate very well, but we always keep our code blue kit ready and on standby. And for KOH, we just simply put it on the slide. And then we take some more slides for grams and sometimes DIMSA, and if you have suspicion for acid fast. The first medium we inoculate is usually chocolate agar, followed by blood agar, and a couple of liquid media, as well as if we're suspecting acanthamoeba, the non-nutrient agar. This is how it goes. And this is what we would see in KOH, simple KOH stain, where we can pick up a lot of information, such as fungus and even pythium, as in this case, microsporidia, as well as pythium. So coming to the last part of this is, it's actually very simple. Even anybody in a small setup can do the gram staining for the patients. So we just have to use a very simple technique of gram staining, in which we can pick up basically whether it's gram positive or gram negative, to pick up whether the bacteria and whether it's gram positive or gram negative. And this will help us to treat the patient subsequently by starting the therapy. So I will skip this video in the interest of time. And apart from gram positive or gram staining, the other stain that we also use often in the lab is acid fast staining to pick up nocardia or actinomycetes or mycobacterium. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Somshila. That was a very nice presentation. And before you leave, just a quick question. Any situation to where you actually repeat the corneal scraping if your patient is not responding to the treatment being given, and if it's negative on the first time?
Yeah. So very important point, I didn't cover it. So when do you repeat scraping is either if you get a negative report initially and the patient is not responding to treatment. Second is you're strongly suspecting fungal or acanthamoeba and you don't get it on the first round. So typically after 48 hours is when you go in for a second time to scrape the keratitis once again. And also the response to therapy is not the way you expect. So again, you might want to scrape. So these are the cases.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll move on to the next speaker.
Thank
Our
you.
next speaker is Dr. Sangeet Mittal. He's head of Vitreoretina Services at Thindai Hospital, Jalandhar. He's very well known for all his interesting surgical videos, and he would be giving us some interesting tips on collection of samples in a case of infective endophthalmitis.
Thank you, Dr. Manisha. First of all, I'd like to thank you to include me in this IC. Shall I start sharing my screen now?
Please do.
Is it visible?
Yes, just do a slideshow.
Yeah. So my topic will be sampling in endophthalmitis, and I think it's very important because endophthalmitis, as we all know, it could be due to post-operative, post-traumatic, or endogenous reasons, and it may involve bacteria, viruses, fungi, acanthamoeba, or biofilms. And the sampling becomes important because 5.2% cases have vancomycin-resistant bacteria, and there is an increased tendency of fungal infections these days. And also, even if we do a primary surgery, it's a poor visual outcome in multi-drug resistant endophthalmitis, and recurrences are common. So if we know what exactly is the cause of the endophthalmitis, we can treat it specifically. And that's why sampling carries a very important role in the management of endophthalmitis patients. So sampling material, you can have an aqueous tap using a 26 gauge needle mounted on a tuberculin syringe. You can have a vitreous tap with using a 22 to 26 gauge needle, again on a 2 ml syringe, a vitreous biopsy taken with a vitrectomy aspiration cutter, or a vitrectomy fluid sample which can be collected during pars plana vitrectomy. So this is the video I borrowed from Dr. Manisha for an AC tap in a patient who had endophthalmitis, how to do it. So once you put the drops, the anesthetic drops, and then you enter the anterior chamber at the limbus, and using a 1 cc tuberculin syringe, you just withdraw a fluid sample to this, and then you take the needle out. And the problem is that aqueous tap, because it's very low quantity, a very low sample is obtained. For this, I had also devised another method of taking this aqueous tap. Here, what we have done is we have taken a suction cap from a nasal dropper, and we have connected it to a 2 ml syringe. And then this 2 ml syringe is again fixed to a 26 gauge needle. So what happens is you just see, you just have to, there's a small hole in the bulb which acts as a safety valve. And this vacuum is created by pressing the bulb after covering the hole. And once you release the suction bulb, the fluid can be aspirated when pressure is released from the suction bulb. And this demonstrates how it is done. You just insert the 26 gauge needle at the limbus, and you just release the pressure, and you can see that the fluid collects into the syringe, and then this fluid is sent for a microbiology sample. You can inoculate this fluid directly after removing the 26 gauge needle on the blood agar plates or other sampling or other culture media directly in the operation theater itself. Now, this is a small video showing how to take a vitreous tap. Although these days we don't advocate taking a direct vitreous tap, because just pulling at the vitreous may cause unsafe vitreoretinal traction on the retina and may lead to retinal breaks and other complications. But just to show how to take it, again, 24 gauge needle is being used here. 24 gauge needle is inserted into the vitreous cavity, and 2 ml, and the vitreous fluid is withdrawn into a 2 ml syringe. Again, you can send this for the culture and the gram staining. Again, this is another method which we do a vitreous biopsy, and we can inject the intravitreal antibiotic at the same time. So this is how you prepare an intravitreal antibiotic beforehand. You dissolve the vancomycin in 5 ml of sterile water. This is 500 milligram of vancomycin in 5 ml of sterile water, making it 100 milligrams in 1 ml. After that, you take 0.1 ml of this solution, and then you dilute this 0.1 ml solution to 1 ml with the distilled water, and that gives you the 1 milligram in 0.1 ml. So you inject 0.1 ml of this solution in the syringe. So your vancomycin is ready. Then you similarly you prepare for your ceftazidime and a dexamethasone injection. Take a 1000. This is a 1000 milligram vial of ceftazidime and dexamethasone, which is 4 milligrams in 1 ml. And you again take 4 ml of sterile water, and then you dissolve the ceftazidime injection in 4 ml of the sterile water. Then withdraw 0.09 ml of the solution. This is just 1 point below the 1.1 ml marking of the tuberculin syringe. And then you dilute this one with dexamethasone up to 1 ml. So that will give you a concentration of the adequate concentration of ceftazidime and dexamethasone mixture in 0.1 ml. So just inject 0.1 ml of this solution. Now, when your antibiotic is ready, what you do is you take while in this vitrectomy tubing, you connect this 3-port with the third extra port is kept as closed. Now you insert a 27 gauge trocar cannula temporally. You can do it either in topical anesthesia or a peripulpal anesthesia, and you cut and aspirate the vitreous till hypotony occurs and the cornea sinks a little bit. So this aspirate collects in the collection in the vitreous tube, in the tubing. Now you inject intravitreal injections through this sclerotomy port only. So both the vancomycin and ceftazidime dexamethasone mixture is injected and the sutureless closure is done. And now you just open the third, you connect a 1 ml tuberculin syringe to this port, and you can withdraw the aspirated fluid into this 1 ml syringe. This gives you an adequate sample and also prevents any vitreoretinal traction on the which is caused by direct aspiration using the syringe, and then this can be sent to lab for testing. Last is a collection of vitrectomy fluid. From here, what I use is a sterile bottle, 500 ml bottle can be used. You can see it is sealed and it has been made sterile. And you connect a IV set to this here, and then you put a 20 gauge needle in the other part, and you remove the bag of the vitrectomy machine and connect this IV set to this machine, and you can see the vitrectomy fluid is collecting into the bottle. So you get a good amount of vitrectomy fluid sample while you are doing vitrectomy into this bottle. Then you can centrifuge the bottle and send it for a culture. So the main investigations that are required will be gram stain, a KOH, bacterial culture and culture sensitivity, and fungal culture sensitivity. And there have been studies in the past which show that vitreous fluid and vitrectomy fluid are the most sensitive samples. Aqueous fluid does not give you that highly positive results as compared to the vitreous fluid, and vitrectomy positive in about 75 to 90% of cases. So take-home message is vitreous fluid is the best sample for culture in clinically diagnosed endophthalmitis, and gram stain and KOH are beneficial investigations which provide results within no time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sangeet. I think there were quite a few interesting and innovative ideas for collection of vitreous samples. I just wanted to ask you, any preferred gauge of vitrectomy cutter for collecting a vitreous sample?
If I'm just doing a vitreous biopsy, I will do a 27 gauge because that gives the minimal invasive, is minimally invasive, and you can do it under topical anesthesia as well. But if I'm doing a vitrectomy, I generally do an endophthalmitis patient with a 25 gauge cutter, because you need to reach quite, sometimes you have to go to the peripheral, removing all the exudates from the periphery is very difficult with the cutter.
Thank you, Dr. Sangeet. So I'll be presenting my talk, which is the next, and which is basically a diagnostic vitreous biopsy in patients of uveitis. So basically, posterior intermediate or panuveitis of an unknown cause is the situation where a clinical examination or laboratory investigations have failed to draw a conclusion on the diagnosis. Is the time when we'll think of taking a sample from the vitreous, or there is a strong suspicion of intraocular malignancy like a masquerade, or a potentially sight-threatening acute uveitis with a negative non-invasive laboratory and ancillary investigations. Or sometimes when you have a very atypical presentation of uveitis and you're not sure what you are dealing with. These are a whole lot of infectious and non-infectious uveitis indications where you may opt for doing a vitreous sampling. As far as the pre-op preparation is concerned, we have to do a detailed clinical history. There are no shortcuts for that. A complete ocular and physical examination in any patient of uveitis, along with relevant ancillary laboratory investigations, are a must. We must also have a list of differential diagnoses rather than doing it anything very blindly. A plan by the uveitis expert about what tests to be done after the sample has been collected is it has to be well outlined before you actually plunge into collecting the sample. We have to also inform the microbiologist and pathologist to be ready in their labs to be receiving the sample. And also it's a good idea to have a word with them to exactly know how they want the samples to be packed and how they want them to be sent to them. Even though it's a vitreous biopsy, an informed consent is essential because it is an intraocular procedure, and we have to counsel the patient very properly, because many a times they think that you are doing it for a therapeutic purpose, while it is basically being done only for a diagnostic purpose. Certain tips for vitreous sampling: you have to collect an undiluted sample as far as possible. So you should not put on the infusion at the start of collection of the sample. And if your eye starts becoming hypotenuse, then you can use an air infusion, which is going to avoid the dilution of the sample. For intraocular lymphomas, if that is your clinical suspicion, then it's best to stop the oral steroids 2 weeks prior to the sampling. The lab is informed of the sample collection and sample coming to their labs, because these cells are extremely fragile, and the sample has to be sent to the lab as early as possible. A low cut rate is used, as low as 600, and all vitreous sample, including the cassette, has to be sent to the lab. Preferably, in most of the situations, the plating should be done preferably in the operation theater. Now, these are the various diagnostic tests which can be performed on the sample which is going to be collected, and we should be very clear in our mind what tests are we exactly looking for. So this is just a quick replay again of what Dr. Sangeet has already shown. So this is just the cutter. So we are just detaching the aspiration line, and we would be now attaching this aspiration port to a syringe. And once you have taken the cutter inside the eye and you have started actively cutting the vitreous, the assistant can gradually collect the sample inside this syringe. So after you have actually collected the sample, you see this yellowish vitreous sample coming into the syringe. You can put on your infusion line. It's always a good idea to expel out all the air which is there within the syringe. Put a needle on top and rotate the needle to avoid any kind of contamination into the sample. You finally cover up the syringe and the needle. And put it in a sterile pack, which is sealed with proper labeling with the name of the patient and the diagnosis. It's always a good idea, if you can arrange, to inoculate the sample in the operation theater itself. So you see all the culture plates and the various medias, you are having it in the operation theater. And I think this is the best way of inoculating your sample, which would avoid the least of the contamination to your sample. Now, this is just an example of an 18-year-old boy from Bihar who had a gradual painless diminution of vision in the left eye for last 6 months. There was no significant systemic history or a contact history with the low socioeconomic status. This is how he looked in his left eye, where he had this huge subretinal yellowish mass in the macular area with subretinal fluid. And there was this mottled appearance on a fundus fluorescein angiography with a hot disc. So we were very sure we were dealing with some inflammatory pathology. We did an ultrasound, which was also not very conclusive. And the provisional diagnosis in our mind was a subretinal abscess, possibly a tubercular etiology, a fungal, and very rarely a lymphoproliferative disorder. The CECT of the chest also did not really add to our diagnosis, but something alarming was there, that the Mantux was 0 in this particular child. And what was suggested by the pediatrician, that either the child was immunocompromised or he was suffering from some chronic infection. So what we did in this child, we went ahead and did a vitreous biopsy because we were not sure what we were dealing with. It's always a good idea, if the media clarity is there, then to go as close to the lesion and collect the sample just above the lesion that you want a diagnosis to be made of. The vitreous biopsy was sent and cultured on various plates. And to our surprise, this child actually was diagnosed to have nocardia infection in the eye. MRI brain was done to rule out intracranial nocardiosis, and the patient was started on the suggested treatment for nocardia along with oral steroids. And you see that there was a beautiful response with resolution of subretinal fluid, regression of the lesion, and the patient recovered a good vision of 6, 18, and 12. Well, vitreous biopsy also doesn't go without complication. There's always a risk of retinal break and retinal detachment. You can also have intraoperative or postoperative bleeding. There can also be a transient hypotony, especially if you are doing a sutureless MIVS technique for collection of the vitreous samples. So I would just conclude by saying that whenever in doubt and not able to confirm the diagnosis, or you have a very poor response or no response to the treatment, then vitreous sample is a good idea in uveitis patients. A preoperative ancillary testing to the best of you, such as all the investigations available like angiography, OCT, ultrasound, and UBM, they should all be done before planning an interventional diagnostic procedure. A clear plan by the ophthalmologist is essential with preparation of the lab personnel, the microbiologist, and the pathologist, and they should exactly be made aware of the sample being sent and what exactly you're looking for. There is no need to control the inflammation prior to a diagnostic vitrectomy because you are actually wanting a sample in hand which can add to the diagnosis of the patient, and then subsequently you can modify the management of the patient. So thank you once again for your patient listening. I will just move on to the next speaker now. I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Lakshmi Mahesh. She's a very senior oculoplasty specialist. She was the ex-secretary and president of OPAI with a vast experience in oculoplasty for the last 27 years. And she would be giving us some interesting tips for orbital and eyelid biopsies with frozen sections. Over to you, ma'am.
She joined?
She is not joining.
I don't think she joined. Manisha.
Is ma'am there, sir?
No, she is in another session, as I told you.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, sir.
Yeah, she's in another session. She said she'll join you. Yeah.
So we move on to your talk, sir.
Sure, no problem.
So I invite Dr. Mahesh Shanmugam, who's head of vitreoretina and ocular oncology at Shankara Eye Hospital, Bangalore. And sir would be giving us some interesting tips on FNAB and excision biopsy.
Thank you, Dr. Manisha, and the AOS for this opportunity to meet you all this afternoon virtually. So you can see my slides, I presume.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll be speaking about fine needle aspiration biopsy and excision biopsy in the next 10 minutes. So let's look at the case. So this was a 60-year-old gentleman who came with decreased vision. And you can see a mass lesion in the fundus, and this looked like a metastatic lesion. This didn't look like a primary. After extensive investigation by an oncologist, including a PET scan, they were not able to localize a primary lesion. This is the exact situation where you would be resorting to a fine needle aspiration biopsy. That is, you know that there's a malignant lesion in the eye, but we are not able to figure out where it is from. That's when we do a fine needle aspiration biopsy. The most common technique which I use is a transvitreal fine needle aspiration biopsy, where you would put on an indirect ophthalmoscope and then visualize the fundus, and using a 20 gauge or a 22 gauge or a 24 gauge, usually a 24 gauge needle, from the opposite side, enter through the pars plana, transvitreally go into the pars lesion through the retina, and aspirate a little bit of the lesion and send it for cytology or histopathology. Transcleral also it can be done. The problem is transcleral, as you can see, goes posterior to the ora serrata. So there is a possibility that it is covered under the conjunctiva and we are not able to see if in case the tumor decides to grow out of the perforation site, we will not be able to make it out easily. And so, and the additional problem is if we penetrate too deeply, we may be going through the retina and creating a break here. Of course, we do create a break here as well, but here the most what we want to avoid is that if there is an extra ocular growth, which will not be obvious. Similar problem exists if there is a subretinal biopsy technique also, but the advantage is here we don't create a retinal break because we go under the retina and into the mass lesion. So, but for all practical purposes, this is the technique which we use. And the equipment is, this is the technique which I use. It's about 1 inch long needle, which is about 24 gauge needle, connected to a small piece of IV tubing and a 10 cc syringe. So here I'm doing a vitrectomy and doing a biopsy. So you can see a total retinal detachment induced to PVD. So when we do a vitrectomy, the technique is a little bit different. So here the needle is plunged into the mass and the assistant aspirates up to 10 cc in a 10 cc syringe, but nothing will come when we do that. But what happens is that little bit of sliver of tissue, which is in the bevel of the needle, is the tissue which we're taking. So we don't expect the mass to collapse. We don't expect that tissue to come into the syringe, but the IOP will remain maintained. Unless it's an abscess, when the eye may start collapsing, if it's a solid lesion, IOP will remain the same. And like once the suction is completely relieved is when we pull the needle out of the mass lesion, because we have to ensure that the assistant has completely left the needle, the plunger tip has hit the end of the syringe before we pull it out. Otherwise, when we sucking in the retina, we may be sucking in the vitreous and causing more problems. So the suction should be completely removed before we pull the needle out of the mass lesion. So this patient turned out to be a carcinoma lung. The cytology of the tissue which we removed from the mass confirmed the carcinoma lung, and subsequently the patient underwent chemotherapy, and you can see the mass lesion going away. So retinoblastoma is seldom biopsied. Most often we are able to confirm the diagnosis clinically or with ancillary tests like such as MRI or an ultrasound. But in the rare situation when we have to do it, this is the preferred route of approach to the needle. We go to the peripheral cornea through the root of the iris zonules and into the mass lesion. So there is no vessels. We are avoiding all the vessels over the eye so that the tumor cells, in case they are stuck to the surface of the needle and they come out, should decrease the risk of spreading. And there are multiple interfaces, once again, rub on the surface of the tumor, and any cells which are sticking onto the surface of the tumor can be removed by these multiple interfaces. But as I mentioned, most often we prefer not to do a biopsy. So finally, last patient, when we do suspected malignant lesions and we are not able to come to a diagnosis, so, and then there is a need for tissue diagnosis, like confirmation of diagnosis or identify tissue of origin, like the case I showed where the metastatic lesion, we are not sure where the primary is from. And another common indication is for tissue for genetic analysis. So if you're treating a melanoma with brachytherapy, it's preferable to know what is the genetic makeup of the tumor, because that tends to affect the prognosis of the patient. So for instance, a trisomy 3, a monosomy 3 is something which is associated with an increased metastatic potential. So before we put the plaque, we can take a biopsy and then to put a plaque over the melanoma. Here's another patient which had a growing melanocytoma. As you can see, a melanocytoma is very, very small. And so we are unable to do a fine needle aspiration biopsy. You cannot thrust the needle into this lesion here, which is extremely small. We'll be causing decrease in vision because we'll be hurting the optic nerve. So here I was forced to do a vitrectomy, then open up the capsule which is covering that lesion which is over the optic nerve, and then take a very, very small bit of the tissue. Because this was growing, we had to ensure that this was not converting into a melanoma, and so we had to do this. So the capsule was opened up and a little bit of the tissue was dislodged and grasped with the forceps and removed and sent for cytology. And when the forceps is coming out of the eye, it's better to switch off the infusion so that there is no outflow of the fluid from inside the vitreous cavity, which can push the cells into the subconjunctival space or outside the eye. So this is a young gentleman, about like 14 years old, with a mass growing out of the ciliary body. So this patient was advised enucleation for a diagnosis of melanoma arising from the ciliary body, but I felt it was a diffusely growing melanocytoma of the ciliary body. But then we had to confirm it, so we had to do an incisional biopsy before we do a definitive treatment. So this is the usual technique of partial lamellar sclerouvectomy is what is being demonstrated here. We create a scleral window, a partial thickness scleral window, and the inner layer of the sclera with a little bit of tissue is removed after doing diathermy to the margins, and then close the flap. Unfortunately for this kid, it turned out to be a melanocytoma of the ciliary body, and we did do brachytherapy, and you can see the lesion going away, and the child continues to retain the eye nearly about 15 years subsequently. And there are situations when we will do an excisional biopsy of an intraocular tumor, and the prerequisites are usually this is done under general anesthesia and the hypotensive anesthesia, because there can be extensive choroidal bleed and we may lose the eye. And these are usually done in eyes with visual potential, because if the eye doesn't have visual potential, best is to enucleate the eye. And preferably benign lesions clinically, or prior HPE by doing an incisional biopsy confirm that it's a benign lesion. In case we are trying to excise a malignant lesion, which is solid lesion, then we have to give a 3 mm clearance of normal tissue around it. Here's one example. This young gentleman had a mass lesion just growing on the nasal side of the eye, and this was exerting a mass effect inside. And this was actually a suprachoroidal tumor, and we did an incisional biopsy which showed a very rare schwannoma, and so we went ahead and doing an excisional biopsy here. So here a full thickness scleral incision is made because the lesion is above the choroid, under the sclera. So a very careful dissection of the sclera away from the choroid is what is being done, taking care not to rupture the choroid. So this is the uveal tissue which you can see here, and this is the mass which is overlying the uveal tissue. And very carefully this was dissected off from the choroid. Unfortunately, I didn't have any rupture of the choroid except for a little bit of a small loss of pigment here. It was not a defect. There was no vitreous loss or anything like that. Use the endochoroid probe to grab onto the tumor and remove the mass lesion, excised it completely. We put it back, and in the process, the area where I had done an incisional biopsy had opened up, so we had to close that also. So this is again the uveal tissue prolapsing out through the incisional biopsy site. And this is the net result. The eye is saved, and he continues to have 6/6 vision. This is a iridociliary melanoma. You can see a melanoma here. So though the patient did not have too much of a cataract, they decided to remove the cataract and put an endocapsular ring because the zonule here will be removed after the surgery. So subsequent intraocular lens implantation may not be supported. That's the reason we decided to put an endocapsular ring. Again, a partial thickness scleral flap is taken. And here a 3 millimeter of normal iris tissue is taken. And so it is said to create a peripheral iridectomy rather than a sector iridectomy. And diathermy to the remainder of the bed, entry into the anterior chamber, and the iris, the ciliary body, and the overlying sclera is removed in toto as a mass. And the open sky vitrectomy is done, and the eye is closed. So this was another patient who had this subconjunctival nodule. Actually, what he had is a melanoma, very small melanoma which had grown in the subconjunctival space through the sclera. So here we had to do a full thickness eyeball dissection. The overlying conjunctiva, the sclera, and the mass was removed, and we put a scleral patch graft and closed the eye. So that's the end of the surgery, and he continues to retain the eye with a very good vision. So the ultimate excision biopsy, of course, is enucleation. Whenever there is no visual potential and the need for diagnosis acute, then we go ahead and do an enucleation of the eye. So to summarize, final aspiration biopsy, the techniques we saw, incisional biopsy in select situations when we need to know if it is malignant or benign. Excisional biopsy can be done very easily in the benign lesions. In malignant lesions, we need to give adequate clearance. And if it is possible to give adequate clearance, then we do an excisional biopsy. And it's reasonably safe with appropriate technique and prompt treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mahesh sir. I think those were very interesting videos. I just wanted a quick comment from you, sir, that when you're doing a transretinal biopsy and you said that you release all the active suction before you take out the needle, isn't there a risk that whatever tissue you have got in the needle, it goes back again after when you're trying to release the pressure?
We should instruct the assistant not to let go of the last 1 ml of the suction abruptly, because if the plunger goes and hits the syringe end, that's when it can get expelled. So that last 1 ml very, very gently releases it and confirm that like absolutely all the suction is released before we pull the needle out. And as soon as you pull it out, you put it in the bowl of BSS and aspirate. So that little sliver of tissue which is stuck in the end of the needle is what is aspirated into the syringe, and we can literally see that little bit of tissue. And of course, like the pathologist has to be as experienced, or nobody can be as experienced as Dr. JB, but then like Dr. J. So because otherwise they lose it, they very easily lose it. So we have to tell them it's a very small sliver, which is what we are sending to.
Thank you, sir. And in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next talk by Dr. Lakshmi Mahesh. She's a very senior oculoplasty surgeon, and she's been practicing oculoplasty.
Again, I'm not sure that she joined.
She's there.
Has she joined? Hi, she joined. Okay.
She has a vast experience of 27 years, and she would be speaking to us on eyelid and orbital biopsies with frozen section. Ma'am, you are muted.
Yeah, thank you, Manisha. Thank you very much for inviting me to this course. In fact, I have prepared more for your talk, your course than the other one. And I'm so happy to see JB sir here. Can you see my slides?
Yes, ma'am. Please do a slideshow, ma'am.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So the anatomy is very important. The knowledge of the anatomy is very important before we ever think of doing a biopsy. And the characteristics of the skin malignancy, sorry for that, ulceration, lack of tenderness, induration, that is thickening, irregularity of the lid margin, some dilated blood vessels like telangiectasia, pearly borders, loss of the architecture are other telltale signs. Now, one has to evaluate carefully, especially about each and every case. This is what we were taught by all our mentors and seniors in Shankar Nethralaya, and that holds good forever. See, this is normal eyelid architecture. Here you can see some papillae, follicles, which are glistening there, and some amount of hyperemia. So this is important, especially one side is already showing some malignant features. Now, this is a chalazion, which has been partly taken off. Now you can see there is a wedge there with some granuloma pouting out. So, and that is the reason why the patient, despite a IND, has residual swelling. Now here it looks as if she has some irritation of the eye and some antosis. But when you evert, you see a diffuse sebaceous gland carcinoma, diffuse variety. And sometimes a junctional nevus or intradermal nevus, when you retract the lid and see, you can see these dilated vessels. So, okay, I can't overemphasize the importance of careful clinical evaluation. Chalazion, again, IND, I hardly do. But if it really has to be done, I mainly do it when they're about to get married in the near future or have to go elsewhere and have visa issues. That's the main reason why I like to do, because I try to or when there are too many, multiple like this, because as much as possible, I like to maintain and manage them conservatively. But again, you have to evert the lid, put in the chalazion clamp, make a small snip for it to drain and do the surgery. Now, recurrent chalazion, especially in people after 40, 45, or those who are immunocompromised like HIV. Now, this patient had 5 chalazion surgeries before he presented. Look what has happened. It has already, a lesion has already spread into the mid-orbit, and this was a diffuse sebaceous gland carcinoma. First an excision was done, but eventually he needed an exentration. Though he did well with the prosthesis, he was severely diabetic. He became very upset about his looks. And he developed subsequently metastasis to the chest, though sebaceous gland first goes to the regional lymph nodes. This patient died of chest metastasis. And incisional biopsy, sometimes you'll have to do. There are different types of biopsy for eyelid lesions here, because this was a leukemia. And this was a lymphoma. She came for ptosis surgery, but when I retracted, I saw the salmon pink patch. So these are snip biopsies. So that was an incisional biopsy. These are snip biopsy. We just take hold of the wart and snip it off. I do it for many of the colleagues also where I work. And gentle cautery can be given. This works best. I don't like to use any of those chemicals, etc., etc. Okay, now shave biopsy is done for junctional or intradermal nevus, because you don't want to take off a complete wedge of the skin. Sometimes they have a small defect like this, which usually fills up. Especially in young patients, we don't want to excise a segment of the eyelid. So this biopsy is really helpful. And this is another example where I was watching a pigmented lesion, and this was what happened. I had to go in. This was a case of a melanoma. I had to go in a little deeply and do a shave biopsy. So what happens? You can have a defect, loss of lashes can be there, and but nevertheless, it's very important to take out the complete lesion. Excision biopsy, just take out the complete lesion in toto. If you're suspicious, age is not on the, if the patient is a little older, then you may give a little margin and excise. And these are all examples, xanthelasma, these warts, these syringomas, where you like to, inclusions is where you like to take out the complete lesion. Sometimes if it's suspicious, you leave a margin around. Now here I left just a 2 millimeter margin because it was looking healthy, and did a wedge excision and approximated. And this turned out to be a basal cell carcinoma. Again, you see the loss of architecture, loss of cilia. This was an early sebaceous gland carcinoma. Here you can go for a wedge excision with reconstruction. And beware of vascular lesions. Don't try to do too much. First ascertain. Here you can do a small incisional biopsy because they can bleed very severely on the table. And this patient had bled elsewhere. And then here I gave her Tricot injections to shrink the lesion before you can take them up for surgery. In a combination of surgery, sometimes snip biopsy, sometimes excisional or incisional can be done. It will be needed in lesions such as amyloid. You can't debulk also sometimes the lesion fully, especially in young patients, because you don't have much of skin there for them, because skin is nice and taut. So combination may be needed. This is an example of frozen section. Here I could give only a 2 millimeter margin above. This was a basal cell carcinoma, very typical rolled out edges, pearly edges, and central ulceration. And sometimes if the pathologist is your friend or your mentor like JB sir, you can write, I'm worried about the medial and inferior margin. JB sir usually wanted us to pin them with the needles like this and send it across for medial and lateral, because that was very easy for him to process. He used to be so excited and he used to immediately tell us what all was happening. But some of the pathologists I noticed subsequently like us to put sutures. So color sutures, blue suture, all these bit sutures we'll sometimes keep and use them here, medial margin, lateral margin, etc. Here the inferior was involved, so I had to take out a 4 millimeters more of it, and then it came out negative before I could embark. This was a large defect. So you see, it's not a very big lesion you think, but see the defect which was created on the table. So here a graft will not do, a flap was needed and a forehead flap is being done. Now this patient had about a lesion which was about 7-8 years earlier. A biopsy had been done and he was told that he had some granulomatous inflammation. When he was told it was a chronic chalazion, he just slept over it for about 7-8 years until it grew to this size, and he comes there for an opinion. And this was done in a very big institute, reputed institute, and the biopsy report also looked very, very authentic. But the biopsy, I realized in retrospect, it had not gone in very deep. So what happened? We had to do a deep biopsy because it was very sure you're dealing with malignancy. Look at the orbit. When he presents itself, half the orbit is involved. So this was a very severe involved sebaceous gland carcinoma. He didn't want exenteration, and he had to do neoadjuvant chemotherapy. They are not very good with chemo. They don't respond very well. Some amount of radiation had to also be done. Then the radiation ocular surface changes, repeated corneal ulcer breaks, couldn't use a bandage contact lens because of corneal ulceration. Finally, about after the 5th year follow-up, I decided, okay, he was disease-free systemically. He was doing fine, and took him up for a medial canthal reconstruction. A year later, he developed a lesion here in the supramid. That photo I don't have here, sorry. And the last 1.5 years, he's lost for follow-up because of the COVID issues. But I don't know what is happening to him. So all for one chalazion. I don't think you should have to suffer your life. He was otherwise very healthy for 11 to 12 years. And this was an unfortunate case again, squamous cell carcinoma. He underwent, he again didn't want, because its frozen section was not done, he had recurrence, and this was the situation after brachytherapy. But later on, he was so ill due to some other reasons, he had diarrhea and he succumbed. But again, the last years of his life was only agonizing, I would say, all for a simple lid lesion. So multiple lesions can be there in the in sebaceous gland carcinomas, nose, ear area. So you may have to do multiple biopsy and under frozen section and reconstruct. Sometimes you have to take the biopsy with the help of a syringe, especially in a dermoid or when there is some amount of infection also involved. And you can accordingly distribute the specimen both for microbiology and pathology. Now, this lesion is a lymphangioma, dramatic occurrence. This could be taken out as 2 separate lesions, but lymphangioma can recur. So I won't call this excision. It's still an debulking or an incisional biopsy only, because the chances of recurrence is there with every respiratory infection. You have to be very careful and guide the parents accordingly, especially if it is a child. It's a common tumor in childhood, and it has it's a cranky tumor. It has devastating effects. In malignant lymphoma, if it is very bulky like this, then you can debulk in addition to doing an incisional biopsy, because you can't take out every single lymphoma cell. These patients will definitely need radiation, but these days we are getting very good results with chemotherapy. Now these are the solid laddu-like lesions, I like to call hemangioma, pleomorphic adenoma, which all come out beautifully in toto, and you can subject them in bottles or in containers for completely if you have taken them out. But here I had to take, this was a lymphoma, I could only partially debulk with a lateral orbitotomy. And so again, along with just don't do, when you have already taken up the patient for surgery, please don't do limited biopsy or a half-hearted biopsy. Then people like JB sir will say there are crush artifacts, there's not enough specimen, please give me more specimen. So pathologists, you think here are greedy. Surgeons should be greedy for good results to make the patient survive. You don't want to make patients, you don't want to lose patients due to eyelid tumors, especially if it's not a melanoma. So this is one of my favorite slides where I did a nice frozen, and last slide, frozen section control. I removed the whole lesion, full thickness skin graft. And this is how, so it's not just only tumor. As oculoplastic and aesthetic surgeons, we should also get good form, good function, good aesthesis. Thank you very much. Thank you, Manisha.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And that was an extensive talk covering all the lesions. We couldn't have asked for more to complete this session, and I won't hold you back from your session, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining. We move on to the next talk by Dr. Saravanan, and he would be speaking to us on retinochoroidal biopsies.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Sorry. Okay. Just switched it on. Sorry. Are my slides visible now?
Yes, just do a slideshow, Dr. Saravanan.
Yeah. Okay, thanks Manisha and the scientific committee for having me here today. So I think there will be some sort of overlap with Mahesh sir's talk also. The first reaction when somebody says you want to take a biopsy of the choroid retina is this, because a lot of times you don't get enough cases to orient ourselves to what are the various techniques involved. And a lot of times you see that the eyes are quite having quite good vision, and also sometimes maybe the only seeing eye, and your anxiety goes up even further. There's again a case of a male patient who had a small iris and ciliary body melanoma with the normal vision, and more or less the same technique which Mahesh already depicted. So here I was trying to, instead of doing internal cut the iris, I thought I'll do it from the outside only, doing a sort of a sectoral iridectomy. So this is how I did, removing it along with the part of the sclera, and along with that doing a broad-based sectoral iridectomy. Luckily, the patient retained 6 vision in this particular eye, and it was proven to be a melanomatous growth there. So mainly, as already these slides already Dr. Manisha has pointed out the various indications for doing this sort of biopsy. I just showed 2 cases of medullopithelioma which we had to deal with there in our practice. So this is a small in a middle-aged man, a small mass, vascularized mass sitting in the ciliary body area near the 12 o'clock zone. So that is the Swan-Jacob lens, which demonstrate the so-called vascular mass there. We're not sure exactly. It was initially diagnosed to be a amelanotic sort of melanoma by oncology Dr. Parag. So we intend for a full excisional biopsy. So sometimes you do a small piece to just check what the content is, but here, so I didn't see addition to either the uvea or the sclera. So when I reflected the uveal tissue, I saw that it was prolapsing out nicely, and then this was sort of like removed like a nucleus, expressed like a nucleus. You can see that's coming out, and It was quite a transluminating also, more like a translucent tumor with a lot of vascular elements in that lesion. So incisional biopsy will mean that you're taking a small piece. This is one around 7-8-year-old little girl, but a small lesion which was picked up during a photograph, night photograph. So yeah, I planned to do an incisional biopsy, but she just dropped off and presented to us approximately 1.5 years from the initial diagnosis, and the tumor had grown nicely with a lot of very fibrotic elements growing onto the posterior capsule, and vision had quite considerably dropped. So we thought we'll go for instead of incision, I thought I'd try to remove as much as possible. And initially, when I tried to remove the tumor, it was very stuck because of the extensive fibrous elements. So then we had to remove the lens, cut the lesion from inside to mobilize it, and then remove it. And the fibrotic elements were extending almost more than 6 clock hours. And I realized that I felt that I had injured the retina at this point of near the 6 o'clock meridian, but I was not sure. So normally, if you felt that you have injured the retina, it's better to immediately shift to a 3-port vitrectomy and finish it off at that point of time only. But somehow I thought I had probably had a small hope that I would not have. This is the area I thought I had injured the retina, but I thought we'll leave it as it is. But eventually she went in for RD, and we had to do the surgery for correcting the RD. She had developed a small dialysis at the 5:30 clock hour, which was finally dealt in a second surgery. Both these cases came up to be a medullopithelioma. So again, this all been shown extensively with the previous speakers, including Maheshwar and Manisha. We are showing a small video of how I take a biopsy. This is a case of suspected lymphoma. Just trying to insert the needle directly through the transscleral upcharge and trying to aspirate in as a dry vitrectomy, not doing much vitrectomy, directly entering the needle and trying to aspirate so that you get a sort of an undilated sample. There's one more case of proven candida, which came on to suspected a fungal abscess and finally turned out to be a candida infection here. So again, you can see that it's a small contraption using a 24 gauge intramuscular needle which you use. So bend it accordingly and then try to take a dry without doing any vitrectomy, directly inserting it and aspirating with the taking already talked about in the previous talk. This again, we did not know what it was. Even the biopsy came out inconclusive. The patient had multiple bouts of uveitis with a mass lesion in the inferior ciliary body area. So we had to do a lensectomy and then directly trying to take a biopsy from that area by trimming it with a bimanual technique using scissors. So it came up with only inflammatory elements where you could not get a final diagnosis. And finally, even though there was no RD, finally I went in for a phthisis, a young kid, around 3-4-year-old kid actually. So this is how to do a retinal biopsy. Nothing special. Like normally we have been doing retinal autografts for all our failed macta holes. This is what we do: do a laser, do a cautery, and then take a small graft. So this is the same technique which you do for retinal biopsy. So people who are doing autografts should be quite well versed with this. This video provided by Dr. Rajesh in Bangalore. So this is again a suspected case of lymphoma, and this is how again the same technique where you do a barrage and cautery. So superficial cautery for a retinal biopsy, but if you're planning for a choroidal biopsy, you have to go lightly press the diathermy into the choroid, and then do a little bit deeper cautery because the vessels from the choroid can bleed much more severely. So depending upon what you want to excise, either a superficial or a deep cautery will be the choice, depending upon whether you want to remove the retina only or the bit of choroid as well. Mainly thing before removing it, make sure that you have trimmed off the vitreous and make a large enough sclerotomy. You don't want to lose this very special specimen because you want to get other sites to remove this. So ideal choice would be superior and nasal quadrant will be the best choice to remove these masses from. So, but while removing, as Sir pointed out, to switch off the infusion and make sure that your sclerotomy is large enough and adequately. This is one case, again a case of lymphoma where the vitreous biopsy was shown to be inconclusive. So doing a nice laser and then diathermy, and then using either a vertical scissor or a horizontal scissor, depending upon the orientation of the lesion, you can, whichever suits your hand, you can use this and take a nice deep cut into the choroid and the superficial retina. And again, as I told you, you have to make adequate so that you don't break this specimen into multiple pieces or lose it. So make a nice sclerotomy and trim out the vitreous around it before you attempt to hold it and remove. And depending upon the size and location of the large defect, you can either go for a oil, gas, or just yet, depending upon the size of the defect which you have made. So these are the various techniques which I've been practicing. So only thing you have to keep in mind, this is the last resort. You have to take the time to take the plain vitreous aspirate, and all those things should be the first choice. When you don't have any kind of very inconclusive evidence from all these, then if it's vision threatening also, you may want to remove take a little bit more drastic approach, because the risk of all these so-called procedures can be quite severe. It may be even in the best of hands. So these techniques should be used very sparingly and only when it is needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saravanan. And I'm sure we have quite a few questions at the end of the session, but let's first move on. This session can't be complete without having the perspective of the pathologist, and who better than Dr. Biswas himself. So I'll request Dr. Biswas. He is the head of uveitis and ocular pathology at Shankar Nethralaya, Chennai. And he would be speaking to us on how to collect, how to transport these samples to the lab. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So what we do, all these biopsy specimens, I'll be talking about that, transporting and plating the samples, the pathologist perspective. So when you have a specimen like that, it can be non-infectious, masquerade, or infectious. So that infectious can be viral, bacterial, fungal, and parasitic. So pathologic study techniques can be AC-tap, iris biopsy, vitreous biopsy, or retinochoroidal biopsy, as has been told by Dr. Saravanan. So in case of fluid, what do you do it? Intraocular fluid, it can be direct smear. If it is a little bit more, you can do the cytospin. Then culture, which is a gold standard. Polymerase chain reaction, so now should be used in infectious uveitis or endophthalmitis. Immunohistochemistry and flow cytometry from the tissue sections, or cell block preparation. Cytology, how do you do it, is a cytospin for concentration of the specimen, where the fluid is put in the funnel and then kept in the cytospin machine, and 1,000 revolutions per minute for 5 minutes. And you get a concentrated smear like this, which can elegantly show the cytology of the specimen. So one can do that in various uveitic entities like anterior chamber aspirate in a pseudohypopian, and this can show the retinoblastoma cells, or lens-induced uveitis where macrophages engulfing lens material, or retinochoroidal biopsy in case of large cell lymphoma showing necrotic background large lymphoma cells. What about culture? Culture is the gold standard, but less sensitive, takes too much time, and not practical for virus infection. How do you transport the intraocular specimens to microbiology? It has been told. What it can do, the sterile broad tube with a rubber band inside to which the needle is inserted and sent to the laboratory, so that the anaerobic conditions can be maintained. And it should be sent as soon as possible in the micro lab within 30 minutes to maintain the anaerobic conditions. And this has been told, the growth of bacteria culture or fungus cultures, which you can see in the plates. In case of primary vitreoretinal lymphoma, one tissue diagnosis is mandatory. Here, the tissues are often necrotic background, so it should be transported within half an hour to 1 hour. And cytologic smears new astute cytopathologists, because they can be confused with the necrotic background and few lymphocytes, the infiltrations which will be seen because the inflammatory component is there. What we do is that also not only the cytology, but we can do the cell block preparation. The fluid is put into that one vial, and the sediment is taken and put into the cytospin. The paraffin block is prepared, and which can be processed, sectioned, stained, and viewed on histologic section. It's easier to do special stain, immunohistochemistry, or cell block slides. And here is a cell block preparation from the vitreous aspirate, showing elegantly pleomorphic lymphoma cells with necrotic background. So diagnostic efficacy of cell block is a high degree of sensitivity and low pseudopositivity rate. So how do you do that? Instead of vitreous biopsy, as has been told, core vitrectomy is better. Core vitrectomy leads to personal vitrectomy is better. Primary intraocular lymphoma, alcohol fixation causes poor cellular recovery. So send the specimens without any preservative within half an hour to the laboratory. And what we see, the pathologist is allowed round or oval nuclei, often segmented with the prominent nucleoli with scant basophilic cytoplasm. This is the showing that lymphoma cells with the pleomorphic large lymphocytes with the large nuclei. And you can see the cell block preparations showing the necrotic background lymphoma cells, which can be stained with the CD2 B cell marker or CD79A B cell marker. Molecular biology has come in a very revolutionized our looking into the infectious etiology in various specimens. And one get at the 10⁶, 1 million copies of the DNA can be seen over here. And what you require is very small, tiny samples and primers for the specific detections, nucleotides, and enzymes. And the specimens can be taken from any part of the eye. Even if you have forgotten to take the specimens for PCR, you can take from the paraffin section of the eyeball, scrape it, and the DNA can be amplified by PCR. This is a PCR machine. The beauty of it is the report is ready within 12 hours. And this has got inbuilt positive control and the negative control. So it detects the high degree of sensitivity and specificity. So various infectious agents can be detected by PCR. It includes a host of bacteria, fungus, or viruses. Many more are getting added every day. Every time there's one. There are several types of PCR is there. I won't go to the details of it. Single step PCR, nested PCR, multiplex PCR, quantity PCR, and last but not the least is a generation sequencing, next generation PCR with the sequencing and direct sequencing. Single step PCR is a one target, one step reaction, 20 to 40 cycle, and you get the CMV, HSV, VZV, Toxoplasma gondii, as well as the tubercular uveitis. Nested PCR, two sets of primer is used. Amplified DNA becomes the second primer, and you will get the amplified product. Advantage is that increased specificity and the increased sensitivity, but there is a risk of contamination and the time and cost. The application is very widely used in Mycobacterium tuberculosis DNA estimations. An example of a nested PCR, this we thought that primary intraocular lymphoma in the vitritis was there with materials in the vitreous cavity, but histopathology showed granuloma, and we confirmed with the PCR that it's a Mycobacterium tuberculosis infection with MPV 64 and IS 6110 region positive. So multiplex PCR, a single PCR reaction can detect multiple pathogens. Each primer set generates amplification of a specific size different from the other. And the multiplex PCR is the advantage is the simultaneous detection of multiple pathogens at one time, cost and time saving, but this disadvantage is the decreased sensitivity due to the primer competition compared to the uniplex. CMV, HSV, VZV, Toxoplasma gondii can be detected. Reverse transcripted PCR, where you can use that enzyme, reverse transcriptase, and can be used in the influenza and bacteria through the ribosomal RNA. Real-time PCR is a further advancement. Here you get the copy number, fluorescent molecule is used to monitor the PCR reaction. An example of real-time PCR is a case of acute retinal necrosis, where you can get the viral copies, 88,740 copies, and you can get that the card, fluorescent card, which detects the, compared to the normal card and detects the viral copies. So PCR is a very useful in the vitreous sample for the viral retinitis. We have studied the 100 suspected cases of infectious uveitis. It confirmed or provided new diagnosis in 70% cases. How to send the sample for PCR? Acetab and vitreous sample are used in the syringe. The movement should be arrested by sealing the syringe with abdo tape or adhesive tape, or you can put in the vial and make it in the sterile, and you can put in the three package, the primary package, secondary package, and tertiary package to make sure that the fluid doesn't leak out. What's new is the metagenomic diff sequencing, which can identify common and rare pathogens. And last but not the least is the MYDL265 mutations, which can be done in the intraocular lymphoma from the vitreous fluid with a sensitivity of 88.9% and specificity of 91.6%. In conclusion, ocular biopsy sample is often small but very precious. Proper handling of the material is of paramount importance. You need to discuss, as told by Dr. Manisha, that with pathologists of your clinical differential diagnosis prior to the biopsy. So pathology can give importance clue to our clinical practice. This is told by William Osler, a great clinician. As your pathology, so is our practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, JP sir. I think that was a very crisp talk, and you covered all the relevant points which any one of us would like to know before we collect the samples and send them to your lab. I just have a few questions since we have a little time left for discussion. I'll just move on first to MPS sir, that when we are doing a fine needle aspiration biopsy, sir, often, we are not able to really collect the sample that we are looking for. What are the usual mistakes that we do if we are not doing it as often as you? If you remember the case I had done, I got a negative sample and then the patient was apparently sent to you and then she was diagnosed with a melanoma. So what are the common mistakes we do?
A common mistake is like the penetration should be ideal. So the bevel of the needle, up to the bevel of the needle should go into the masked lesion. And as I mentioned, the assistant should aspirate abruptly up to 10 cc and hold it on for about a minute and then release the syringe suction. And the end part of it is when they release it very, very slowly. And then you don't pull out the needle immediately, then push it a little bit further. So it's a kind of a double pass. You should not pull out the needle out of the mask, then push it a little bit further, but ensuring that we are not penetrating the sclera on the other side. So again, repeat this procedure. So twice or thrice with the needle inside the mask, repeat this. And once all the 2 times or 3 times when you have completed it, release all the suction, then pull it out and immediately put it into the bowl of BSS and aspirate. And the tubing between the needle and the syringe also, it's preferably it's a shorter tubing rather than longer tubing, because the amount of fluid which has to be aspirated from the tip of the needle to the syringe will be more if the tubing length is longer. So if it's a shorter one, then the amount of aspirate which we do is lesser. And once we aspirate, then we hold it against the light and swirl it, and we can see that little sliver of tissue which is moving around. So that's what we do. And in case we are not too sure about the indirect ophthalmoscope technique, because indirect ophthalmoscope technique can be a little bit clumsy because everything moves the opposite way, because it was like laterally as well as upside down, it's inverted. So in which case better to go ahead with the vitreous biopsy technique, or you can put the biome and hold the light pipe and use the right hand, whichever is the dominant hand, and through the we can either put a trocar cannula system or go through the pars plana itself, visualize the mass and thrust it inside. We can do it that way also.
Thank you, sir. I'll just have a quick comment from all of you regarding intraocular lymphoma. I think that is something we are most of the time getting negative samples. So any special tips from you, MPS sir? And then I wanted to know that Dr. Saravanan showed doing a retinal biopsy in a case of a lymphoma. Was there any specific reason for resorting to a retinal biopsy?
So, was a video from Rajesh. They had inconclusive evidence from the vitreous sample. That's why they had to go for a retinal biopsy.
But I think usually we do not resort to a retinal biopsy in these cases.
Yeah.
But this lady was an interesting patient in the sense like we have repeatedly suspected lymphoma, but like we have repeatedly taken a biopsy and it turned out to be negative. And one night she lost subsequent to scarring in the macular region. And we suspected a tubercular etiology and she was undergoing treatment for tubercular etiology. But again, the suspicion of lymphoma came up. So that's the reason I decided to do a biopsy. So we did the retinal biopsy because the lesion was involved in the retina. So it was not subretinal, it was involved in the retina. So that's the reason we took a biopsy. And then again, it proved to be not a lymphoma. And again, I think Dr. KK had seen the specimen and could demonstrate the granuloma inside in this particular specimen which was sent. So subsequently, the patient was continued to be treated for tuberculosis. And one key thing about like the biopsy for lymphoma is should stop the steroids at least 2 weeks before. If the patient is on steroids 2 weeks, then the biopsy specimen is likely to be negative. So that's something which we need to remember.
I had a similar case. I could not get the video. A suspected nocardia. Initially, we tried to do it was slightly temporal to the fovea, around 2 disc areas. It was extended, it was a little bit large and extending outside the macula. So we tried the FNAC and it came in. It was not possible to isolate. Then we did a small retinal biopsy using a vertical scissors, and that finally it turned out to be an ocardia. So, I mean, I could not get that.
Preferable to do a bimanual technique, actually. What we showed was a unimanual technique. Preferable to put a Chandelier and do a bimanual technique, hold the lesion in the one hand, hold the tissue in the other hand, and use the scissor to cut it.
Yes, sir. So Chandelier is very important in case you are dealing with such a very large specimen also, and also sometimes small specimen where you want to manipulate, it will be difficult. So using a Chandelier will help you to easily manipulate within the eye.
Dr. Saravanan, you showed a retinochoroidal biopsy. Apart from doing a very heavy cautery before you are actually cutting through the retina and the choroid, is there anything else you are doing to avoid a choroidal bleed?
So mainly cautery only. You can use diathermy also, whichever is available in your place. Trying to use the Vex sponge to slowly, rather than slice it directly. I a lot of times use a Vex sponge to sort of what do you call sort of a blunt separation, you can call that. So rather than sometimes you need to use sharp blades also, but using the Vex sponge sometimes helps to minimize the apart from the diathermy or cautery.
Dr. Sangeet, since you've joined back, we have a question for you that in endophthalmitis cases, what is your take on induction of PVD, and how often do you land up putting in silicone oil even if the retina is on and there are no retinal breaks? Do you still recommend putting silicone oil in a few cases?
Dr. Manisha, in cases of acute endophthalmitis, so you're doing a vitrectomy in cases of acute endophthalmitis, what I feel is that there is no middle way. Either you do a core vitrectomy and give an intravitreal injection, or if you are going to induce PVD, you do a complete vitrectomy and then you put in silicone oil, because what happens is there is a lot of traction. So there's a lot of vitreous left behind when we do a vitrectomy in endophthalmitis that causes the tractional, that retracts and causes traction and causes breaks or even giant retinal tears post-operatively and may lead to problems. In cases of chronic endophthalmitis, which have already been resolved, the inflammation is less. In those cases, I just clean up the vitreous and do give an intravitreal injection, and then I don't put in silicone oil.
MPS sir, what is your take? Because now we have a paper from LVPI, of course, which shows that silicone oil has antibacterial or antimicrobial effect also. So a lot of people I've heard talking in sessions where they say that every case of bad infective endophthalmitis, you should, aim for a complete vitrectomy with silicone oil. Though the old teaching has always been that you just debulk the vitreous and you just leave the antibiotics inside. So has your practice changed after this paper has got published?
Yeah, even before that, like we had started doing a complete vitrectomy because of the CEV study from Europe, because they have shown that like doing a complete vitrectomy has a better chance of eye salvage and better visual acuity. So not that like every patient will go ahead and do a complete vitrectomy. Wherever it is feasible, the PVD is happening, and then in those situations we'll do a peripheral vitrectomy as much as possible, debulk the vitreous and leave it. It's not changed that I will do silicone oil in every case. That's not what I'm doing. But then, like if it's an aggressive infection, if it's a recurrent infection, or if there is any suspicion of RD, then we are a little bit more liberal in putting silicone oil because of two reasons. One is, of course, it retains the eye. Second one is, of course, like the bacteriostatic effect of silicone oil, which has been demonstrated by LVP. So I'm a little bit more liberal, but I don't put silicone on every case of endophthalmitis.
Dr. Saravanan, what about you?
Yeah, I also don't use silicone oil as a routine thing. In Madurai, they have a policy of putting oil irrespective of the retinal status in all gram-negative infections, because they feel that the salvage rate is much more poorer in that. But in my practice, I usually do it only when there is a suspected or proven retinal break, and occasionally for sequelae when the eye is going for phthisis to see if you can salvage something. But contrary to the points which have been discussed, like about the bacteriostatic effect, I think Dr. Abhishek Kothari, he was showing some slides in yesterday's talk, where he showed that he was able to culture both fungus as well as bacterial in vitro in the lab in bowl. 4 ml bowls of they shaped it to simulate the eye vitreous cavity, and they were able to grow organisms using silicone oil as a culture. So the question of whether it acts as a bacteriostatic at least does not apply. It seems to apply in the lab scenario. Whether it works inside the, I'm not sure.
That's totally like the opposite of what we have been hearing.
Dr. Vivek Dave's case, that was also in the lab only. It was
Yes.
in vitro only. Dr.
In
JB
vitro.
wants to say something, I think.
Yes.
Silicon, I don't think is a bacteriostatic. You cannot kill a bacteria by silicon.
And what about the first line of the broad spectrum intravitreal antibiotic injections? Any change in that, or we are still sticking to the old ones?
At least in my practice, still going with the routine protocol, original protocol.
So you're doing the
Unless it is a cluster. Unless it's a cluster. If it's a cluster, we usually go directly with piperacillin as the first choice. But if it's an individual with no significant, suspicion of a gram negative, it's usually a routine. If you're suspecting a severe form of gram negative, I may choose piperacillin as the first choice, and all the clusters definitely piperacillin we feel as the first choice till it's proven otherwise.
In this COVID time, I don't know how many of you have seen cases, but we are getting very bad endogenous endorphs. And they're usually coming up with organisms. Even we recently had one lady with a bilateral endogenous endorph diagnosed with Klebsiella pneumoniae. We lost both the eyes, and it was multi-drug resistant.
I had 3 cases of fungal endogenous endorph following COVID, recovered from COVID. One patient had bilateral, and we couldn't do anything, lost.
What about Dr. Mittal and NPS, sir?
I have seen a few cases and they turned out to be fungal endophthalmitis, but they responded quite nicely to intravitreal voriconazole. Though I just saw 2-3 cases and not much of an experience.
I think those are mostly the candida ones which are responding well to voriconazole.
Mainly, I suppose so.
NPS, sir, any cases seen by you?
Not really. What my colleagues had seen only, I think it's to do with, again, the number of IV fluids. So because IV fluids themselves are known to cause them. And in addition to the COVID, the steroids, everything put together, I would think. So we did have a couple of patients, but not too bad.
So I just want to thank each one of you for taking out time for joining into this session. I think we've had great presentations and great discussion, and I'm sure the tips provided by all you experts are going to be extremely useful for all the people who attended the session today, and look forward to meeting you all physically next year in AIOS.
Thank you very much, Manisha.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manisha, for your kind words. Also, thank you so much for thanking all the expert panel of doctors that we heard today. With this, we come to the end of our tips and tricks session for ocular samples, and we've ended the session successfully, and you all can wait because in 5 minutes we'll start with another very interesting session at Hall Helmholtz. So if you all can wait, I would be very happy to be your host. Let's have just a 5 minutes of break now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
You too, ma'am.
Manisha, for inviting me into this session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.